There are short periods in my life where I've been able to predict who I'm going to meet on the day or what is going to happen. It began with my grandma. I suddenly felt she was visiting my parents' house, so I called to tell them, and she was already there. Another day, I took the bus and I told my friends we'll have two accidents in a single trip. This is what happened. I've been able to do that for 1 month with teachers, friends, family. The last one in this period was the death of a family member, and then it suddenly stopped. And I really felt the stop. You cannot do this anymore. And I also remember that when I was very young, maybe 8, I was on my way alone to school, and in my head I said, I'm about to find a red kitty in the next street. And guess what? A very sick red kitty. He was exactly how I saw him in my head. I gave him to a family because I couldn't take him to school, but sometimes I had news. Recently it came back. I was wondering what it would feel like to have the nose broken. During the night, I accidentally broke my nose and 3 more times the following month. It may be a coincidence, but I'm not convinced. Here, I summarise as much as possible, but I've experienced many paranormal experiences. It's very difficult to find explanations. I come from the Occitanian culture, which come from the old times when French and Spanish culture was somehow mixed. There are some hypotheses, but I would like to have the point of view of several cultures. Let me preface this by saying that I'm not per se a believer in the supernatural, but I'm also not a denier either. I take the approach of there is a lot in this world I don't understand, and I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt. But one thing that's been bothering me for as long as I can remember are experiences where I would dream about something bad happening, or get an inexplicable feeling of impending doom, which often is followed by notable circumstances happening shortly after. Often bad, but sometimes good too. The most notable example would be when I explicitly told my brother, our dad will either kill himself or one of us soon. And soon after my father killed himself by accident, brain tumour caused him to accidentally leave a chainsaw running in the car while he was in it, causing him to suffocate himself. Notably, a good friend of mine had also given me a tarot card reading of death only a month or so prior. They assured me that the card didn't mean literal death, but change. But I had a strong feeling at the time that in this case, the change would be a death. Some more subtle but notable things would be gut feelings about people after I just met them, telling me they're a danger, which would later turn out to be correct. Or sometimes just knowing that something is very important without being able to explain how or why. Anyway, this morning I woke up from a nightmare, only to be immediately told by my partner, who woke up before me, about the volcanic eruption. We live in New Zealand, so it's relevant to us. This whole day I've just had a gut feeling that something more is coming, so I've been calling my friends and family to tell them to be careful, and I mentioned the nightmare to my mom. That's when she told me that she never wanted to tell me because she was worried that she'd scared me, but that she herself had been having prophetic dreams all her life, and she's been suspecting for a long time that I inherited the same ability as her. In short, I'm shocked and honestly a bit scared. I don't know what to make of this. My mom is a very religious woman and is strictly against superstitions. For her to tell me something so openly is a big deal. So many random things are just coming back to me now, which all seem so impossible. And I guess I just want to hear other people's thoughts and stories. Please don't take this as a story to debunk. Again, I'm sure there are probably perfectly rational explanations for these things. All of this just brought up memories of how my friend's conspiracy theorist father made a big deal about how I have a rainbow chakra or something, and how I sometimes feel like I can see ghosts, even though I don't even strictly believe in them. My eyes catch glimpses of shadows all the time, which I now just jokingly call shadow people. Yes, I know those are a thing, because they fit the term. So my fiancée used to live in this run-down, extremely old house. We're pretty sure it was actually a barn at one point that was then converted into a home. Well, let me tell you, that house is the most haunted location I've ever stepped foot into to this day. It's been almost 4 years since we've been inside, and we'll never go back. When my fiancée was younger, she was kicked out of her childhood home and went to live with her best friend just down the road. Her room was actually a porch with its own exterior door, and a door leading into the living room of the home. Just to set the scene for you a bit, she had vaguely warned me that there was something in the house, but I kind of just brushed it off. Well, one night I went to stay over with her. At the end of the night, we were both pretty tired and decided to go to bed. We got under the covers, all cuddled up, and not even 2 minutes after turning the lights out and closing our eyes, it happened. It sounded as if something, very large and almost animalistic, stomped from the other end of her room, right up to the side of the bed and began breathing heavily and almost rhythmically, while staring down at us. I know she heard it too because the breathing began to get faster, and faster and faster. That thing was breathing the tighter she was squeezing me. I never asked her if she felt the same, but I could feel that whatever that thing was, it was evil. We were both absolutely terrified of what could have been looming over us like that, both too petrified to even open our eyes. We just laid there gripping each other out of pure terror. And then, all at once, it just stopped. At the very same second the loud breathing stopped, the air around us got lighter. I shot up, my eyes darting around the room, looking for anything to explain what we had just experienced. But there was nothing. Just a dark room around us. We slept with all the lights on for the rest of that night. A different night I was there, the glass of a picture frame shattered and woke us up. We would hear running upstairs in the loft, even though there was nobody else in the house, and whispering that sounded like there was someone just outside the window, trying to tell you a secret. Something would bang on the door, in between her room and the living room, while violently shaking the doorknob. One day, an old baby picture of someone neither of us recognised just showed up on her table. And the nightmares I had when I would sleep there were unlike any I've had in my life. But nothing compared to the fear I felt the night that thing walked right up to us, watching us in bed from less than a foot away. I'll never forget that. I was 11, staying at my father's place for Christmas holidays. The house and the apartment were new, so was the small neighbourhood of identical 4-storey houses. I was staying in the kids' room that had a bunk bed. The room didn't have much furniture apart from that and the carpet on the floor, because none of my dad's kids were staying there full time, until my second sister was born later. Anyhow, I was sleeping on the bottom bed. My dad was in the living room playing video games, and he would stay up until 4 or 5 a.m. I was trying to fall asleep when I heard footsteps on the carpet in my room. Soft footsteps that were walking on the carpet, sounding as if they were approaching me. I was facing the wall, too terrified to look behind me. I never felt such fear in my life. Hearing it became so terrifying, I called out to Dad a few times. He would come into the room, sit with me for a few minutes so I'd calm down, but I wasn't able to fall asleep while he was there. He would go back to play video games and the footsteps continued. They weren't audible when he was there. It certainly wasn't the sound from his PC in the living room. The sound was clearly in my room. It didn't sound like the neighbours above either. The sound was too clear and soft. I would call out to Dad, he would sit with me, and again when he would leave, the footsteps would resume. He became annoyed at me after a few times, so I ended up sleeping on the top bed with the lights on. I remember crying and being upset that my dad didn't believe me. After a while being on the top bed, I started to hear purring. I wasn't sure if it was my stuffy nose or actual purring, but at the time it really calmed me down. A few months ago, before that, my cat died and I was still not over it. So it made me happy to hear that, even though it happened in another country at my mother's place. So I'm not sure about that sound. I fell asleep shortly after. The footsteps didn't happen anymore after that when I stayed there. Eventually, my dad rented out that apartment. The only other weird instance that happened there, but not in any other place I've lived, is me sleepwalking when I was 8. My dad told me I would come out of the room and go into the corridor and stare at the front door. So I live in a rural place and in a heavily wooded area. I've always felt totally safe in the woods, even at night. I used to go for night walks all the time. I'm not really a skeptic. I do believe in some paranormal things, though I've never had an experience until this one. Regardless, I still always try to find the most logical explanation, and I don't often feel scared or unnerved by things. This experience, however, really freaked me out, and I've been thinking about it ever since it happened, so I thought I'd share. So this was a few weeks ago. My parents had gone to bed, but I wanted to stay up late, so I settled into the living room to read. Our living room has these giant windows, almost covering the entire wall. I left the blinds open and turned on one lamp and sat right by the window. My elderly dog, who had been let out already to go to the bathroom for the night and was back inside, started pacing the house and barking and wouldn't settle down. This is unlike her. She's super old, so she usually goes right to bed, and she knows not to bark in the house like that. We let her out again, and she went right back in. We gave her some food, and for about an hour, she kept pacing and barking. She wasn't even barking at the windows or looking outside. She just paced up and down the halls and barked at nothing in particular. This kind of weirded me, but I just shrugged it off, and then she finally settled down to sleep in my parents' bedroom. About 20 minutes later, I was reading on the couch by the window with my cat when I heard an animal walking outside. I only heard it take a few steps. It sounded large, and I figured it was probably a deer. My cat jumps up and acts super interested in what's outside, pacing up and down the windowsill and peering out there. Then, after a few minutes, the screen of the window furthest from me across the room starts shaking violently, like something is shaking or banging on them really hard. Again, these windows span the whole wall. It startled me and I looked over. I couldn't make anything out in the dark or see what was outside. And then the shaking and banging grew even more violent, and the windows next to me started shaking too. My cat freaked out and ran out of the room. At this point, I was really scared, and I did something you'll probably think is kind of silly. I literally closed my eyes and threw the blanket over my head and waited for it to stop. The shaking lasted for several more seconds. I remember being taken aback at how much force seemed to be behind it. I just couldn't bring myself to look. I had an awful feeling, and I think if I looked and saw something horrible, it would really traumatize me. It finally stopped, and I stayed under the blanket for 2 entire hours before I could work up the nerve to get up and go to my bedroom. The next morning after I woke up, I calmed down a lot and figured it was probably some kind of animal. I went outside to go look at that window to see if I could find tracks or something and look at the screens. What I found made my skin crawl. There was a single long diagonal slash in the window screen of the window I was sitting right next to. If you're standing in front of where the slash is and looking inside, the slash aligns right over the spot I was sitting. No tracks. So that's creepy as fuck. And what's weird to me is that if it were an animal, why weren't there more slashes? Just one single deliberate slash is strange. There were absolutely no scratch marks or slashes anywhere else on the screens or around the windows, just that one. The other screens were just pretty loose now. If it was a bird, I would have heard wings flapping. I feel like I would have heard animal sounds if it were any kind of animal. If it were a person, which is even scarier to me, I would think someone who would do something like this would have taken it further and probably have done more to scare and intimidate than just shaking some windows and slashing one and then just leaving just to scare me. Besides, the shaking, there were absolutely no other sounds. And since we live rurally, the chance that it was a person seems more unlikely. It freaks me the fuck out, but there's nothing I can really do about it other than put up trail cams. Nothing like this has ever happened to me the entire time I've lived here. A few nights before this happened, I actually started feeling some bad vibes from the woods at night, to be honest. Like I said, I'm normally very at ease with them, but I was out smoking a few nights before in my backyard. I just felt like I was being watched, and something was just making my skin crawl. And I had been avoiding going outside at night again, and then this happened. This experience really kind of freaked me out, but there's not much I can do, except put up some cameras. Full disclosure, this happened about 11 years ago. I was 10 years old at the time, I think, but I still remember it. I'm not sure if I'll ever forget. My granddad had gotten cancer. I don't remember what kind it was, but I hadn't thought anything of it when it first started. I assumed he was just getting old. He was in his mid-50s at the time. It was winter break, and my brothers and I were staying at a family friend's house. She and her husband had been friends with my grandparents since before I was born, and they lived about 100 feet away. That night, I had a dream. It was cloudy, I believe, or was it fog? Either way, it was overcast, and my grandfather's white Chevy Silverado was parked on the street by his and my grandma's house. He was sitting on the toolbox installed in the trunk. I don't remember his exact words, but he said he loved me and he wanted to say goodbye before we left. I was pretty close to my granddad and I was confused. I didn't understand where he was going, but I woke up. When I woke up, my parents were there. I was confused because they usually waited to be called before coming to get my brothers and I. They sat us down and explained that our granddad passed away peacefully in his sleep last night. I was really upset and asked my brothers if they had any dreams about him last night. They both said yes and recounted the exact same dream that I had. I realised that he had come to say goodbye before leaving. I'm not sure if he visited my grandma as well, but I'm sure he would have let her know he loved her. Maybe 3 or 5 years ago, I asked my brothers if they remembered this, but they said no. But I know it was real. I was raised Christian, and I know the Lord let him say goodbye to us one last time. I've been keeping that inside for the past 11 years, but I'm not imagining things. My wife and I were married for 28 years before she passed away 14 months ago. She died of a heart attack and it was very quick. My 3 teenage children lost their mother and I lost my best friend. I was in a deep state of shock and grief for the first 6 months. I had a few dreams about her that felt very real. We would have conversations in these dreams and I just assumed this was my subconscious dealing with grief and finding some closure. Then, on Valentine's Day, I went to bed and I pulled the sheet over my head, and just as I was falling asleep, someone slaps me in the face 3 times and lays down on top of me. I sit up and it's my wife. And I'm definitely scared, but happy and excited and confused, all at the same time. I say, "Laura?" And she answers me saying, "Yes, it's me, and I love you." I couldn't see her face because she had her head turned away from me, and I asked her to look at me, and she told me that she couldn't. I just held her, and after a little while, she faded away. The next morning, I called my daughter and told her what happened. I told her that her mom had visited me last night. She said that, yeah, Mom visits me in my dreams occasionally. I told her no, she was here with me in person in the bed, with me. And my daughter just said, "Oh, that's sweet." After about 3 weeks, I had come to the conclusion that I had just hallucinated the whole thing. I know how powerful the mind is, and some very strange things happen when you're dealing with grief. I moved into a new home in March, and one night I was in the living room and it was cold in the house. Maybe 55 degrees. I was getting ready to go to bed when I noticed I could see my breath. Because even though it was cold, it certainly wasn't that cold. I lay down in bed and right before I fell asleep, I felt my dog climb into the bed and scoot up against my back. I was laying on my side. I thought it was weird because my dog doesn't normally get in bed with me. I was looking out the bedroom door into the living room and I saw my dog walk by. So of course I freak out and roll over quickly, and there she is, my wife again. Only this time I can see her face and it's completely black. I mean like black as midnight. I tell her I love her. She says I love you, and I ask about her skin, and she says apparently that's something that happens where she's at. We had a very long conversation. She tells me that she's made some friends, and it's okay where she's at. She also says it's very cold. She tells me she's with me and she's going to stay with me. After a while, she fades away. This has happened probably 10 more times since March. We've had sex a couple times, but mostly we just hold each other and talk. More often than not, I keep a sheet between us. I normally sleep with a sheet above me, and she normally smacks me on the face 2 or 3 times to get my attention. This is very real, and I'm just relaying something new that's happening in my life. This happened in 2017. My room is in the basement and has a hopper window with a streetlight outside. So my room wasn't pitch black, but very lightly illuminated. Still too dark to make features out from across a room with the lights off. I was laying in bed facing the wall my bed was pushed against, and it felt like someone was over near my closet across the room, looking at me. My back was to the closet, but I could just feel it, so I turned around and got my phone flashlight, and nothing was there. Okay. I went back to sleep. A few days go by, and I feel like someone is looking at me again. My back is to my closet again, I'm facing the wall. This time, they feel closer, like in the middle of my room, between the closet and my bed. I grab my phone flashlight and look. Nothing. Back to sleep. Facing my room, this time because I swear I've been feeling something looking at me and getting closer and closer every few days. I was terrified. So, like a week goes by, and I feel it getting closer and closer, but I see nothing every time. Eventually, my back is to my room again, and I feel like it's standing right at the side of my bed, standing over me. I turned around quickly, no flashlight, looked up and saw nothing, but it felt like it was there, staring at me. I grabbed my phone flashlight without looking away or blinking. Nothing. I'll go back to sleep eventually. A few more days go by. I'm sick. Laryngitis. No voice, the whole 9. My friend lived with me and my parents at this time. This was like 5 years ago. He was upstairs because I lived in the basement and his room was upstairs. My back is to my room. I feel it starting again, except it feels far away again, like back at my closet across the room. I have no voice, remember this. I look at my closet in the dark and stare while reaching for my phone. I'm scared, and it feels different this time. Angry. I don't blink or take my eyes off of my closet. I see a black outline of what looks like a woman in a long dress, like 1800s style. Maybe my imagination. I finally get my flashlight on, and before I can point it at my closet, it comes rushing toward me, still all black. Not walking, just gliding directly towards me, very swift. I scream. No voice. It doesn't touch me as it goes away once my phone flashlight lit up my room. I scream and crawl to the end of my bed and flick on the light. I'm screaming help, but no voice. I called his phone. He's upstairs and I can barely make words because of the no voice thing. But I whisper, come help. He comes and I'm hyperventilating in my bed, holding my knees, staring at the closet. I tell him, whispering what happened and how I felt it building up for weeks. But ghosts terrify me, and I didn't want to give it energy by entertaining it and telling everyone. He takes me upstairs and I sleep on the couch and he sleeps in the armchair. I slept in the living room for a few nights. He eventually tells me that when he falls asleep on the couch, sometimes he hears someone walk back and forth in the kitchen and stop on the ledge where the kitchen goes into the living room, but he doesn't ever see anything. Nothing ever happened to me again, and I never saw or felt anything again since then. So, I'd like to start out by saying that I highly doubt that my experiences were caused by an underlying mental illness, or even a carbon monoxide leak, considering I've never experienced these feelings anywhere else, and had gone through months of trying to figure out what was wrong and testing for a leak, which never led us anywhere. But with that said, I can't always be too sure. I moved into this house in July of 2016, and it was just after my father and I. It was a nice 3-bedroom house in a nice, well-kept neighbourhood on the outskirts of town. When I first visited the house for the viewing, it was like a dream, and it was the only house we had seen that really stood out to us. And we eventually ended up closing on it because of how much we loved it. There were no negative feelings, no feelings of sickness, nothing. But as soon as we moved in, things started to change in ways we couldn't really understand. Doors would close on their own. Lights would shut off or on after you've left a room. The unmistakable sound of someone in the garage and back porch, and just an overall sense of unease. The house always felt like it held heavy air, and that sense of ease never lifted even when I had friends over. Nothing ever seemed to help. At night, it felt like you were being watched from the corners of the room, and the only room I felt safe in at any point was my room. But I often cleansed it and burned incense frequently, and kept it up ritualistically, and that seemed to help a lot with keeping that room energy free. The first instance I can remember so vividly that still shakes me to my core was during the first month of living there. I had been sleeping on the couch in the living room because there was just something about my bedroom that kept me from sleeping, and the only place I felt comfortable enough to sleep had been the living room. I remember falling asleep around 10 p.m. and had a very, very strange dream, from which I woke up in another dream that still makes me terribly anxious to think about. I had woken up and slowly started to sit up. I was in my living room where I had fallen asleep, but my body felt very heavy, and it felt physically like I was laying down on my couch, but I was very much so sitting up. It was still dark out, and I started to look for my phone, when a figure down the hall by my dad's door caught my attention. It was a very tall and dark figure standing there. It was darker than the hall around it, and it felt downright aggressive, like I had done something personally to offend it. But before I could even move, it was charging at me. I felt the door shake and heard the sound of rustling fabric and very deep laboured breathing, which only stopped as I shot awake, sitting up from the couch. Nothing was out of place. The only thing that hinted something had been there was my cat, who had his back hunched and was hissing towards the hallway. Luckily, it was roughly 7 a.m. and the sun started to rise, and I didn't move from my spot until the entire room was covered in the light of the sun. When my dad lost his job when I was almost 18 and we had to sell the house, things started to stir when everything started to be moved out of the house. Due to my dad having to get a job in the city, he was going to move in with his best friend who lived not far from said city, and he was going to help me get an apartment when I turned 18, since we were likely going to sell the house after my birthday. Well, that left me alone in the house by myself after my dad moved out, only coming down on the weekends to take me into town to get food, as I couldn't drive at this time. During this time, I moved my bed into the now empty living room, because my room began to feel so unsafe and heavy. At this point, I was cleaning my room and house every day, but it never made it feel any better. The only place I felt I could be safe and watch over the house was in the living room, so that's where I stayed. When I would turn off the lights to go to bed, I would hear footsteps walking up and down the hall, never approaching the living room, and eventually they would stop. But not before they would start to speed walk towards the living room and just stop a few feet shy of the living room. Sometimes I would hear knocking in the kitchen when the cats would be laying with me and the dog would already be with my dad. There'd be a knock here and there and then almost rhythmic for a few seconds and then stop. Every night I experienced terrible night terrors that I couldn't wake up from, where a man with an unidentifiable face would be screaming somewhere in the house and wake me up, and then would come storming into the living room. At this point, He would point at me and continue yelling before storming up to me as I scrambled to get away. He got on top of me and started strangling me, and as he did this, his face would distort into this terrifying face I can't even begin to describe, while the house would begin to set ablaze. This happened every night until I moved out. Some smaller instances while I was living there. The sound of a man yelling and screaming in the garage, throwing tools around, and very loud music. But when you go to check out, you'd just be met with a dark, dead silent and an untouched garage. It could not have been from my neighbours either. We lived in a cul-de-sac and my neighbours were placed just far enough that you could barely see their front doors from the street. My house and one other house were one of the only houses you could really see the front door while on the street. That other house is the only one we could hear, and our neighbours were always quiet beside us when their family and friends would come over. I would constantly wake up with bruises all over my body, but they oftentimes looked like fingers. And there was usually 2 or 3 in the same place that would oftentimes look in the mirror to see bruises that weren't actually there, on my face, my neck and my torso, and had people point out bruises that would be gone in minutes if not seconds. I'm not sure what was there, but I don't ever want to live with it again, and I hope it's not causing the next family any problems. First off, I was very close to my grandmother. I was her first grandchild, and we had the most amazing bond. Now, as a 27-year-old man, I still occasionally feel this happy urge to go and visit her, even though she's been gone for years. She taught me a lot of things, including gardening, which was one of her favourite things to do. We used to garden together, which later made me buy my own allotment to grow vegetables and flowers. So I had owned said allotment for a couple of weeks, when my grandmother came to visit me. She was so proud of what I had done to the place, and then she told me she had cancer, and that she probably wouldn't survive for long enough to see all my flowers in the garden blossom. That broke my heart. Within weeks, she was in an intensive care. When I visited her in hospice, just hours before she died, she was in a coma, and I begged her to let go, which she did. My family owns a house just by a fjord, river. My grandparents also used to have a house there, so my grandmother had wished to have her ashes spread over the water, so she would still be close to us. I picked her favourite flowers from my allotment as my last gift to her. I put the flowers in the water, as well as a sip of beer, which she also enjoyed. 2 weeks later, I got a call from my mum. She just wanted me to know that 3 yellow freesias had appeared on their private pier overnight. The flowers are not indigenous to my country and actually quite rare to come across. And they were just as fresh as if they had just been cut. Needless to say, we were all shocked. Mostly because only my mum and I knew that yellow freesias were her favourite. My dad and brothers would have never thought of it, let alone pulled a prank on us. As a reminder, I have a freesia tattooed on my arm. The new house I built on my allotment bears her name, and every spring I plant dozens of freesia bulbs in her memory. It could all be a mean prank, but in my heart I know it wasn't. She just wanted to let me know she was still around. So, I've been back and forth on whether or not to tell this story. Mostly because it involves some aspects of my working life that I'm not at liberty to discuss. But also because it had severe personal implications for me. Anyway, I've decided to share it here, and I hope you understand why there are things I simply can't go into detail about. This all started in December 2020. As part of my education, I was scheduled for a 6-month internship at a psychiatric hospital. I had previous experience with working with this type of patients, so I was really excited about it. I switched around the 4 different wards in the hospital, so I treated a lot of different people with lots of different problems. I was curious about all the different aspects, so I never said no to a task, which meant I came across everything from murderers and paedophiles to suicidal teenagers with personality disorders. In my work life, I've had people spit at me, verbally and physically assault me, throw shit at me, and all that stuff. So I like to think I'm a pretty tough guy. And besides that, I always carried a personal assault alarm. One press of a button and staff from every ward would be there in a matter of seconds. On one of the wards, I quickly noticed that there was a certain room which was monitored 24/7 by a guard. To be clear, this is a pretty normal procedure, either because the patient is physically abusive, suicidal, or restrained. But most patients get the watch pulled off them relatively quickly. I asked a colleague, and she told me it was a female patient, let's just call her Anne, who was extremely aggressive and psychotic beyond belief. At that point, Anne had been restrained to her bed for 3 months. I could not believe what I was hearing. We have really strict procedures when it comes to restraining people with belts. By the way, they're soft belts made of fabric, not leather. So, restraining the patient really is the absolutely last resort we go to. I asked the chief psychiatrist what was up with this girl, and he just scoffed and said, if only I knew, but honestly, she defies logic. He told me that at first they thought she was psychotic, but her symptoms only got worse, no matter how much different medication they tried. Then they thought she might have suffered a trauma and was in a dissociative state, but that still didn't fit the profile of her symptoms. She had gone from being a perfectly normal woman in her 20s to being violent, extremely aggressive, and unable to speak in just 4 months. That's practically unheard of, especially as no drugs are involved. We regularly make a toxicology check of all our patients, and always when they're admitted. One day, my alarm went off. They're all connected, so I know where I need to run to help my colleagues. I immediately knew it had to be Anne, and I was right. She had only had her legs and torso fixated. Again, normal procedure, if the patient otherwise is relatively calm. She had defecated in her hand and thrown it at the guard watching her. She then proceeded to bite her fingers so hard that 3 or 4, I can't remember the exact number, had really bad fractures. Both her hands were a bloody mess, and she needed like 50 stitches afterwards. It wasn't the blood or the fact that she would throw her own filth at us. I had seen that loads of times, but the screams this woman made, it was the most primal, guttural and terrifying sounds I had ever heard. Scared me shitless. The best way I can describe it is something like a bear growling and a mountain lion hissing and spitting at the same time. I've seen my fair share of people in primal distress, but I could never have imagined that a person could make a sound like that. As an intern, I'm in no way allowed to use force, so I was just watching as 7 of my colleagues tried to fixate her fully on her bed. They had serious trouble pinning her down. Remind you, these are really experienced people. At least we called a medicinal alarm, which immediately calls for a chief psychiatrist to make decisions. He decided to forcefully medicate her. They gave her one and then a second shot. It only seemed to piss her off, even though it should have put a bear to sleep. At the 3rd injection, she calmed down enough so that they could restrain her. She never nodded off. She just breathed heavily and kept staring up at the same corner of the room, sometimes smirking at something only she could see. Fast forward 2 weeks. I was back in the ward. It was a relatively calm weekend, so there wasn't really much to do. Anne was in one of her good periods, so she had had her restraints removed. A guard was always by her, though. I was sitting in the office when suddenly I saw Anne walking in the hallway without a guard. I don't know if he had taken a bathroom break or whatever, but he wasn't around. So I caught up with her. I asked her what she was doing in the hallway alone, but of course, she didn't respond. I should mention that many of my colleagues were afraid of Anne, and rightfully so. Even though everyone is aware that it's the illness and not the person attacking you, but when it keeps happening, that patient does catch some stigma. I, for one, always try to look at the person and not the illness, so I asked where we were going. She took me by the arm and led me to the common area. She went over to her book cabinet, turned and looked at me and muttered, "Read." book. I was completely taken aback by the fact that she was speaking. She pulled out a random book and handed it to me. She then sat down on the floor and started rocking back and forth. I joined her on the floor and started reading the book. It was just some random old book, probably from a charity, and it had no special meaning. But as I read, she came closer and closer to me. She then cuddled up to me, put her head on my lap and fell asleep. One of my colleagues came by and she looked absolutely shocked. And before I knew it, 5 or 6 people, including the chief psychiatrist, were looking at me reading this random book out to her. I caught a lot of praise for this, which is always nice. But then, things took a turn for the worse, for me at least. It started one night when I was home alone. It was a completely normal night for me, until I heard something from upstairs coming down the stairs. The best way to describe it is it's like a big dog thrashing and tumbling down the stairs. You know, like when a dog rushes down the stairs to greet you. But this was bigger, much bigger. I could hear the weight of something tumbling down, while nails or claws or whatever slid on the steps. I got up, thinking that somehow there was a massive animal in my house. But there was nothing there. That scared the ever-living shit out of me. I had never had anything like that happen to me. I left the house and stayed the night with my parents. But I also had strange effects on my body. Like I had a filter over my eyes or something. Everything started to seem out of focus, like tunnel vision, but with a massive blur added to it. And then I started to disassociate. I had this feeling of being totally out of contact with my body. Then came the panic attacks. My girlfriend called an ambulance one of the times because I was on the verge of a heart attack. The paramedics said I had a heart rate of 240 BPM. I've had no prior problems with my psyche, but I figured it was stress. I have suffered from sleep paralysis before, but never with hallucinations or whatever you want to call it. But that started recently. I see a large black mass with long arms and legs sitting in the top corner of our bedroom, like a massive spider, but just with 4 legs. This is now happening on a nightly basis. A couple of days ago, I told my girlfriend about it because she kept pestering me with questions about my nightmares. She said, "That's funny. Every time you're just about to go to sleep, you look up in that corner and you sort of smirk." That reminded me of Anne, and now I'm absolutely terrified that I might have brought something home. Believe it or not, that's up to you. I've never treated a patient like Anne, and none of my colleagues had either. It was scary stuff. And I've never suffered from any psychological problems before. Never. But something is going on. I'm sure of it. It feels like it wants to get back at me or something. I don't know. And by the way, Anne is much better today. She's in a rehabilitating home where she thrives. One day, she might even be able to have her normal life back. We were in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and it was around 4:30 a.m. A group of friends and I had just left a party, and while they were all very much not sober, I'm straight edge and can recall this clearly. We tried calling a taxi, however there was an awkward number of us, so we couldn't get one to carry all of us. So we decided to tramp home. It was about a 35-minute walk, so not that far. However, it had been a big session, and we were all pretty done. Just moaned about not having a ride, when a random old-fashioned black taxi, think London cab, pulled up alongside us. These taxis can usually hold 5 or 6 passengers, max, in the back section, but this can had 9 seats, one for each of us. The door opened by itself, and everyone climbed in, and without anyone saying a word, it proceeded to drive us to our destination. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but we all spent the whole ride in silence. The cab smelt so bad that I didn't even want to breathe, and the interior was old and very dirty, with the floor even having a few small holes. Looking into the driver's cab, the driver was a very old man, looked to be 70 years old maybe, wearing an old tattered suit with an old newsboy cap on his head. But weirder still, a man in his late 20s was sitting in his passenger seat, wearing ripped and dirty sweatpants, and a dirty jumper with stains all over it. Neither of these guys spoke the entire trip to either of us, or to any of us. It was just silence the whole way. Not even the radio was on. When we arrived at our destination, I heard my intoxicated group of friends out the taxi. But when I turned to pay the fare, the taxi was gone, and the road was completely clear in both directions. We all go into my friend's house, and nobody spoke a word of what happened, until the next day, when the most wasted of the group told us about the trip that he had the night before. I'm not sure what the hell happened that night. All I know is we were a group of Catholics in a Protestant part of town, and getting into a random car like that was the dumbest shit I've ever done. But somehow, even though it stank and was clearly wrong in every way, it felt like it was exactly what I should have done at the time. For some background, I was very interested in the paranormal from a young age. My father and brothers had told me of an encounter they had while staying at a hotel in London, and that was enough for me to believe in something being out there. When I was in middle school, I was allowed to have sleepovers at my best friend's home, and she warned me about the hauntings she experienced overnight. I saw shadow figures, watched doors open, heard footsteps, and many more things at that house. I have a very distinct memory of sleeping over one night, waking up at exactly 3 a.m, watching the bedroom door open, and feeling something coming toward me. I doubt this is related to the encounter I'm about to explain, but I'm including it in case anybody may think it's due to the severity of the experiences I had at that house. After having experienced those things, I woke up one night at 3 a.m. in my own home, rolled over in my bed, and saw a very clear figure of a man looking out my bedroom window. It looked to me just like my dad, who was still very much alive and was sleeping down the hall. So I said out loud, "Dad, what are you doing?" The figure turned to look at me, in which I was able to see it did in fact look exactly like my father. However, I knew it wasn't him. I looked back at the window, so I closed my eyes for a minute, and when I opened them, the figure was gone. I know I wasn't dreaming, because when I opened my eyes, I also dropped my iPod on the ground. And when I woke up the next morning, it was on the ground in the exact position I dropped it. Also, to be sure, I asked my father if he came to check on me during the night, and he assured me that he didn't. Really, what I'm getting at here is I'm wondering if anybody has an idea of what type of spirit or entity would appear this way. I've read about negative spirits appearing as people you know, or somebody that looks less threatening, and I'm even thinking that maybe something followed me home from my friend's home. I lived in that house for another 10 years or so, and never had another encounter there. Would love to hear what anybody thinks about this. Before we moved out together, I would stay at his place until around 1 a.m, and I would park my car sideways at the very top of the gravel driveway, making a tea. In the gravel driveway, there were always 2 cars parked, and the one closest to my car would be one that his brother had been working on for a while. It didn't drive. Anyways, one night, I was about to head to my car, and usually I don't mind walking up there alone. But that night my fiancé said he wanted to walk with me, because it was a pretty night. While we were passing his brother's car on our left, we heard a little bang. Don't exactly know what it could have been. We both looked over, and I immediately saw what looked to be someone ducked behind the car, with his head just a little up where we would see his eyes looking at us. With it being dark, I was questioning if I was seeing what I thought I was. So I looked over at my fiancé and saw him staring in that direction as well. He apparently thought maybe it was his neighbour, who was our age and we knew well, just messing with us, so we called out his name. Right as he did that, the head ducked out of our sight. My fiancé, knowing I had to get home and us both being confused, put me behind him and walked to the driver's side of my car, which is on the other side of his brother's car where we saw the person. We were both expecting someone to be there, but once he got to that side, no one was there. We were both so confused. Like, we should have heard the gravel if they moved. And where could he have moved? The car was too low to the ground to get under it. There wasn't anything else nearby for them to hide behind. And again, how did we not hear the gravel move if they moved? Obviously, it could have been someone just trying to steal tools out of his brother's car. But all of it is still weird. We couldn't explain how he just disappeared. Anyways, he never let me walk up the driveway at night by myself after that. This happened in September of 2020 in Aiken, South Carolina. I didn't grow up there, and we only lived there for about 6 months, so I'm not too familiar with the area. Some of these details are pretty boring, but I think it helps explain the setting and situation better, so I'm going to give them regardless. My fiancée, G, had reconnected with an old friend from high school, B, and we decided to rent his basement, which was renovated into a separate apartment, while we looked for a place of our own. The house is not in a neighbourhood. It's pretty rural in that area, in my opinion. We had neighbours, but each house had several acres of land separating them. B had 2 large adult dogs, around 60 pounds, and our dog was a little smaller than them at the time. The dogs would run around and play in the woods at the edge of the backyard. Everything was good for the first few weeks. Then at night, we started feeling very unnerved if we had to go outside. I know it sounds so cliche, but it felt like something was standing in the woods staring at us. If we went somewhere after dark, we would do a speed walk, almost running from where we parked our fronts all the way around the side of the house to the backyard, which is where our entrance was. Then we started hearing it. As I mentioned earlier, the dogs ran and played in the woods, so we were very aware of what it sounded like when a 60-pound creature was rambling around in the woods. This was much bigger, so much bigger. It wasn't just the 3 of us hyping each other up to be scared either. Anyone that came to hang out, there was a pool in the backyard, so we had a fair amount of visitors, would hear it, and no one ever stayed outside after the sunset. We thought it was a bear, because whatever was making the noise was huge, much larger than a person. So a bear is the only thing that really fits in our minds. A few months go by, and we find our own place, and we were in the process of moving out when this occurred. My fiancé was up in the car, arranging the boxes so that we could maximise the space we had available. I had just carried a box up to him and was walking around the side of the house. From the front to the back, the yard was sloped downhill a little bit. As I was walking down to go around from the side to the back of the house, I saw it, staring dead at me, straight into my eyes. I'm pretty sure my heart stopped beating for a few seconds, and I completely froze up. Some instinct inside of me made me begin walking again. I felt like I shouldn't run, but tried to act normal and get my ass inside. As soon as I got inside, I shut and locked the door, but immediately had to unlock it and open it back up, because I couldn't lock my fiancé outside with this thing. I immediately started seeing these gruesome, gory pictures in my head. Pictures of me and my fiancé, beheaded, completely mangled and broken, laying on the floor of our apartment, with everything that was left in the apartment smashed on the floor around us. Then right after that, something like, no, that's not what I will do. My fear of the unknown is making me unreasonable. If I just let it in, it won't be like that. I kept having the weirdest urge to basically invite it in, which is absurd because the door was cracked open, and honestly, even if it had been shut and dead-bolted, if that thing wanted in, I'm pretty sure it would have gotten in. I was torn. I wanted to call out to my fiancé, but I didn't want to startle the thing by yelling, and I didn't want my fiancé to come rushing down to the door and have that thing spring on him and attack him. Finally, I couldn't take it any and yanked the door open. I was planning on running to the car, but my fiancé was right there. He had seen the thing too, and he had been watching it watch us. The second it turned and disappeared into the woods, he rushed down to the door. This thing was super tall, super skinny, and a sickly shade of whitish grey. It had brightly lit up, glowing eyes. One very crazy detail is that I swear the eyes were a golden colour, and my fiancé swears they were red. I don't understand any of this, but especially that part. The worst part of its appearance, however, was that it didn't have a mouth. Besides its bright eyes, the rest of the face was just skin. Tightly stretched, but perfectly smoothed out skin on its face. What the fuck? I've never felt in my life such a shock. Like just a feeling in my heart that something was so wrong, as I did when I saw that thing looking into my eyes, with its smoothed out skin where it should have a mouth. How do you eat if you have no mouth? How do you stay alive if you can't eat? Sometimes I worry that I honestly had the chance to meet and interact with a completely different species, and I blew it by being judgmental and fearful. This thing wasn't like me, so I was deathly afraid of it. Did I have a reason to be afraid? If it had wanted to hurt us, I'm 100% positive it could have. My fiancé said he could feel the evil radiating off of it, that I need to quit beating myself up because it did not have friendly intentions. I know that this sounds so totally and utterly fake that it's absurd. I wouldn't believe this if someone else posted it. I'm just wondering if anyone else has ever seen anything like this. And if they have, maybe they can tell me what the fuck this thing is. For months after it happened, I wouldn't talk about it. Anytime my fiancé brought it up, I would shut the conversation down. I didn't want to even think about it because I was scared it would make me think of it somehow and come back and find me again. We won't live near there anymore, and now I know there's an irrational fear anyways. I never told anyone about it, and neither has my fiancé. I couldn't bear to spill my guts to someone I'm close to about this situation that was so intensely terrifying and borderline traumatic. I know that sounds so drama queenish, but it's legit the most fearful experience of my life. And have them look in my eyes and not believe me. It would destroy my relationship with the person, and I don't want that to happen. I don't have many people that I'm close to, and I would prefer to keep them. Thanks for listening, and if you have any ideas of what this thing is, please let me know. When I was 12 years old, my twin and I were super into ghosts and would watch ghost shows on TV all the time. One that we watched would do a segment where they'd take a cup, turn it so it was bottom up. Everyone in their circle would put their finger on it. They called this a seance, and they'd ask yes-no questions, and if the cup moved, that was supposed to mean a yes. So obviously, my siblings and I had to try this. One summer day while our parents were gone, my twin and stepbro dragged the coffee table into our bedroom and closed the door. We had the cup, all put our pointer fingers on the cup and started asking if anything was there. At first, we could tell stepbro was messing with us and trying to move it without us noticing. So we told him if he was going to take it seriously, just leave. My twin and I stayed seated and stepbro went to leave. But right as his hand touched the door handle, the cup started moving in a clockwise fashion, sort of slowly. Of course, I'm not moving it. I ask my twin if she's moving it, and she says no, and is looking a little worried. Stepbro was watching from the door, and the cup started moving a bit faster. I take my finger off the cup and go towards stepbro, watching in horror as the cup continues to move faster and faster. Bless my twin, because she held on for a bit longer. But eventually, the cup was moving so fast, her hand wouldn't stay on it, even if she'd wanted it to be there. The three of us run screaming out of the room. The cup is still moving, and no one is touching it anymore. I have no explanation for what happened that day. All of us ran screaming from that room, and the cup eventually ended up on the floor. Honestly, I have no idea if it flew off or what, because I was gone. Still one of the most bizarre things I've ever experienced. Alright, so this happened around 6 months ago or so. I live with my grandma, and sometimes she leaves days on end to visit her sister and leaves me home alone. Now this home is old, and we live in a forested area. Weird noises and all that fun stuff occur all the time. However, this was different. One of the days my grandmother was gone, I was awakened at around 3 a.m. I knew it was 3 a.m. and I knew I was awake because I checked my phone to see the time. What woke me up was from what I heard, was my front door opening, which was odd to me because my grandma hates driving at night, but I still assumed that my grandma was home. I turned off my phone and rolled off on my bed to face my bedroom door. I hear some creaks, and this is when shit gets weird. I don't know if I just fell asleep really quick or if this shit actually happened, but as I was looking at my door with my head under the pillow, I saw what appeared to have been my door open, with a hand dangling by my room light. I once again just assumed this was my grandma and went back to sleep. In the morning I woke up, called for my grandma, just to find out she never came home. Now this is when I had a small freak out, because I was awakened by my front door opening. Yes, I locked all the doors. This was day 1. Day 2 of my grandma being gone was my small freak out day. I double checked everything. My front door was locked, my back door was locked, everything was just the way I left it. My day went on normally. When nighttime hit, the entire time I just had this feeling I was being watched, observed. I closed the blinds to my house and essentially locked myself in my room. I was watching some Star Trek with my window open and heard branches or leaves crack outside. Living in a forested area, I assumed it was deer or rabbits, so I gave a quick glance. I opened my bedroom blinds a small amount, and well, it was obviously dark, but I saw nothing. Nothing that could have made the sound of branches breaking like that right out the window. Nothing creepy happened that night, but I still felt uneasy. When my grandma finally came home, everything went back to normal. No more uneasy feelings or feelings of being watched. However, now, whenever she leaves for multiple days, it comes back.